Thank you all very much for coming to Kilcullen here tonight for the first of our series of talks in relation to St. Bridget under the auspices of the Kildare Federation of Local History Groups. Thank you particularly for coming here, because I know there are lots of other attractions for us historians on tonight and this week. We can all, I think of 2 or 3 other places one would want to be bilocating or trilocating during Heritage Week. Anyway, thank you very much for coming here. As I say, this is a series of talks about St. Bridget. We wanted to try and emphasise the real character of Bridget, the historical figure, in the run-up to what I'm told is the sesquicentennial next year, the 1500th anniversary, Bridget 1500. And I just got a message there from Bridget Loughlin, the Heritage Officer, who will be along, but she'll be late. So I should acknowledge her support and that of Kildare County Council under the Bridget 1500 heading. We have flyers here about the rest of the talks. Basically, we'll be running one a month up to February of next year, February of 2024, which is the actual anniversary. So if you want to take one before you go, to remember all the other dates, and of course, we know you'll be back for all the rest of them. So anyway, that's enough of an introduction. Tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Niamh Wycherley, is opening proceedings, and Dr. Wycherley works in the Department of Early Irish as a medieval historian, specialising in the Early Irish Church. She's in Maynooth. She previously held IRC and NUI postdoctoral fellowships in UCD and NUI Galway. She won the NUI Publication Prize in History in 2017 for her monograph, The Cult of Relics in Early Medieval Ireland. She's the principal investigator of the 4-year SFI IRC Pathway Project, Power and Patronage in Medieval Ireland, Clonard from the 6th to the 12th centuries. She contributes regularly to RTE Brainstorm and television programmes such as the RTE1 documentary Finding Bridget with Siobhan McSweeney, which I certainly enjoyed when I first saw Niamh on the subject of St. Bridget. So, over to you, Niamh. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Brian. So thanks to Brian and the Kildare Federation of Local History Groups and to Kildare County Council and everything for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to talk as part of Heritage Week this year. So thanks for having me along. Now, so today I have, my title of my talk is The Real St. Bridget, and I'm going to get into why I've titled it in this way. Like, essentially, Bridget means a lot of things to different people, right? So to some, she's a pagan, so-called Celtic goddess, she's a peace-weaving poet, she's a smith, she's a Christian saint. And like many early Irish saints, Bridget is an elusive figure, okay? Her identity has been moulded by later authors, by devotees, communities, and vested interests. She is currently enjoying another resurgence. She was adopted by some as a symbol, kind of feminine power during the Repeal the Eighth referendum, and also with the decision to make her feast day at the beginning of February the much anticipated new public holiday from 2023 onwards. So she's found a firm foothold now as an Irish feminist icon. So people have been rebranding and reinventing Bridget for 1400 years, I like to say, so kind of from 100 years after she lived, since the first surviving poems and written sources in the 7th century, okay? But what I want to talk about today is who Bridget is to me, and I refer to her as a real Bridget. And I do this because my job as a medieval historian is to try and uncover the past from the period that roughly covers what we call the Middle Ages, so about the 5th to the 12th centuries in my case. And my work mostly focuses on Ireland, but Ireland, of course, was part of wider Europe. So I read the primary sources, the primary written sources is what I focus on. I read that from other jurisdictions also, okay? And I read what specialists of these other areas write so that I can better understand developments within Ireland. Because nothing, of course, exists in a vacuum. Ireland was always part of the wider world. So the real Bridget to me, as a historian of this period, is a real flesh and blood woman. Not dissimilar in biological makeup to you or I, someone who once walked this earth and near these very, area that we're in now, okay? Now, I should perhaps adjust my title to put in real, in inverted commas, and a question mark at the end, because, of course, we can never really know, right, in history what is real and what isn't, okay? The evidence is all biased, right? Everyone's account of something that happened is always going to be through a particular lens, right? So as a historian, I'm trained, and continue to reinterpret life and events from many centuries ago. I take into consideration new discoveries, new research, new perspectives from new scholars and that kind of thing. And we're always reevaluating the past, because the past is not something that happened, or it's not something that we can understand exactly what happened. We're trying to get closer to an understanding of the significance of different people and different events and that kind of thing, okay? So, for example, when I say kind of new discoveries, that's a big word, but it's something we can kind of see at the moment in the relation to the study of women. And that's something that I think is really important in relation to St. Bridget, in that a lot of what we have traditionally known about women in history, and St. Bridget in particular, was always studied and presented via a particular lens, and a lens that generally ignored women and the role of women, okay? So it is only, and this happens, it's not just in relation to women, it happens in lots of different areas. Historians work, maybe a group of historians, or they influence each other over a number of decades, and then it takes maybe a new generation to come along and to see the same evidence from a different lens. But sometimes archaeologists or technological advancements do actually uncover brand new information. And again, in relation to women, what we've seen recently is the new DNA studies and that kind of thing, okay? So DNA analysis didn't exist before. Now archaeologists are able to kind of sex a body, let's say, that they uncover from the ground, that they would have previously said this was a man based on the fact that they were buried with a sword, that kind of thing. Now they have DNA analysis to say that this was actually a woman. Okay, so we have a couple of things going on. We have reinterpreting the evidence that we've already had, and we have new discoveries, okay? So I'm saying this all to you now because I think Bridget has been done a kind of a disservice in a way by scholars in the past, and perhaps even by myself. And she has been kind of represented as someone who, to many scholars, didn't even exist, okay? What I'm going to show you this evening, when we look at the evidence, there's more evidence for the real Bridget than there are for many other individuals from the exact same period, okay? But she's kind of fallen victim to a way that women especially were represented in the past, okay? So let's get into then the so-called facts, okay, that historians are supposed to be investigating, right? So kind of the who, the what, the when, the where, all the WHs, right, of medieval Ireland in this case. So, and what is significant to me about Bridget is that the earliest sources actually concur and corroborate in many respects in how Bridget is actually portrayed. There's a consensus in a lot of respects that I'm going to show you. There's consensus in the primary sources, and I think that's something that hasn't been kind of represented or kind of shown by scholars very well previously. So just an example of this, and not to kind of pick on anyone in particular, because this is written by a very accomplished scholar, but the Dictionary of Irish Biography, when you Google someone, it's a very eminent publication, very easily accessible online. And the entry straight away about Bridget, says, basically questions whether she existed at all, even though her biography is up on this site. And you know, what I kind of have circled there, because I find it, you know, slightly bemusing, but again, not to, you know, point anyone in particular out. This is a kind of an attitude that you find in a lot of scholarly sources. All men, I might kind of like mention under my breath. You know, so we have, it's uncertain whether she existed as a person, but also she's well documented in the annals, hagiography, genealogies, and liturgical literature. So we've we've two things going on here. We've people repeating that she didn't kind of exist at all, wasn't a person, but there's loads and loads of evidence for her, lads. So, you know, I think we can follow the evidence and say, you know, if all of these early sources are saying that she existed and this is exactly what she did, I think we should take them at face value to a certain extent. So, as I said, let's kind of dig into this and look, I kind of did up a bit of a word cloud of what are the kind of things that come to mind when you want to discuss someone's biography. Okay, so anybody's biography, right? Modern, in the historical, medieval, and these are the kind of things I'm thinking. You know, you're looking for a chronology, maybe. You know, what about their birth, their death, where they came from, who their family were, what impact did they make, what achievements, what, you know, why are we talking about this person, why are they famous, what kind of legacy did they leave, okay? And what I want to do here this evening is I'm kind of going to go through all of these, right, and tell you what we know about Bridget in all of these instances. So if we start with chronology, if we start with the dates, right, and this is apparently what historians are supposed to be spending all their time working on, but let me tell you, you know, history is not all about particular dates. We don't know a lot of exact dates for a lot of big historical events or cultural shifts, you know, or famous individuals. So what, as I get onto it in a second, what is important is establishing a kind of a general time period. But this is something that people really get stuck on in relation to Bridget. So I wanted to talk about it here tonight, right? So I have some examples there from the Irish Annals. And Annals, as I say, are yearly records of major events. Okay, so we have a lot of death notices in the Annals because obviously history is obsessed with famous people, most of them men. So we have kings and bishops, then also battles, plagues, extreme weather, famine, that kind of thing. They're really interesting, actually, if you just pick a random year and see some of the things that are noted. For Bridget, okay, these are a variety of dates that are entered in the annals. So scholars have in the past said, okay, well, there's a confusion here, right? Whereas actually, I'm not going to get into the technicalities of this. When you study this in detail, which one particular scholar, Daniel McCarthy, has, shows you that the analytic confusion over dates was actually a characteristic of the sources. It's not something that's unique to Bridget, and it's very decipherable with just a little bit of investigation and reconstruction. Okay, and he's done that so that we don't have to do it for you. And I can give you that reference afterwards, if anyone is interested. What he has shown quite clearly is that 524 is the year that the early annalists believed Bridget to have died. And that's an important distinction. It's not necessarily the year that Bridget died, but it is certainly the year that they believed she died at the time, okay? And again, there's a consensus across the sources that this is the most likely year that she died. So we can dispense with that. We can firmly place Bridget in a distinct time period. Now, while it is true we do not have much firm historical information for Bridget, such as the exact events and chronology of her life, you know, we don't have a lot of that information for any individual from this period, including St. Patrick. So extremely few documents actually survive from this period in Irish history. And most of the documents, in fact, that do survive for the period that, you know, this early medieval period that I study, they survive in copies that actually were taken that are now in the continent, okay? So, you know, we'll have a Paris manuscript that was a copy of something that was originally written in Kildare. We just don't have a great survival of the physical manuscripts themselves. They got destroyed, fires, wars, battles, everything. They got destroyed over centuries, okay? We have little contemporary evidence for any of the famous early Irish church founders, right? And this is never really used to argue that those, mostly men, Patrick, Kevin at Glendalough, Finney Clonard, etc., it's not used to argue that they didn't exist, okay? So there's something going on here where it's only Brigid is being argued as the one, that perhaps didn't exist. Our earliest surviving written sources were actually 2 documents written by Patrick in the 5th century. And even though these do preserve his own voice, which is really important, we actually know less about the historical reality of Patrick than we do about Bridget. We don't know exactly when he lived and died. We don't know exactly where he was from. So we know these things for Bridget much more so than Patrick. Okay, what's important that I want to stress here is that we have a context for Bridget. So even if we can't say exactly that she died in 524, that's what the early, our early ancestors believed, we do know that it was around that particular time, so we can place her straight away then in the context, and we can study that kind of world that she lived in. So this is what's really important when you're studying history, is to understand these contexts. So I want to talk a bit now about the context of the time in which Bridget lived, and also I say 2 important time periods, which she lived, and also the period in which the earliest stories about her survived, okay? So maybe roughly about 100 years or so after her death. And when we can kind of learn a little bit more about these contexts, then we can understand the significance of Bridget's achievements and her activities. So I would say for us to understand St. Bridget's world, we need to understand multiple relevant contexts. So what I've listed here, and perhaps another historian could even add more to this, I have late antiquity, I have the in context of the historical sources, the early church, early Irish society and the legal system which she was functioning in, and also the position of women in this society. So if we tackle Ireland in late antiquity first. So we know that Ireland was never politically part of the Roman Empire. However, as we can see just from a few examples that I have on the slide, that doesn't mean that Ireland was apart from the rest of it, apart from its neighbours and apart from the rest of its world. These are just a few things. We have Ptolemy's map from the 2nd century, which is down on the bottom right, which shows different kind of kind of kin groups and kind of dynasties, territories within the map there of Ireland, which isn't crazily wrong or anything. I mean, we can understand the map of modern Ireland from it. We have some Roman coins that were deposited in the 4th century that were found at Newgrange. I have 2 texts there, just kind of the covers of their modern editions. So Tacitus's Agricola from the 1st century and Ammianus Marcellinus from the second half of the 4th century. And these 2 sources talk about interactions with peoples in Ireland at the time. For example, Ammianus Marcellinus, he says about how the Scotti, as we were referred to, Scotti meant Irish, that there were different kings and kind of territorial units that were making incursions into what was part of Roman Britain and what is now Scotland, and how the different kind of leaders were dealing with the Irish and the interactions between them, okay? So Ireland was very much, it wasn't politically part of the Roman world, but we need to understand Ireland within the context of late antiquity. If we move on to kind of what early Irish society was like within this time, mostly a lot of our evidence for this is coming from the legal sources, for which we have this massive compendium of legal texts. The Irish, if anybody's wondering, we're always obsessed with the law, lawyers, judges, and highly litigious since year dot. So the society was patriarchal and hierarchical. This is really important for people to understand. Individuals were explicitly stated as not equal before the law, okay? And this is explicitly stated as different to Roman law, where in theory you had a kind of a more democratic outlook. The Irish law text said people are not equal before the law. You are somewhere within a distinct hierarchy, going from kings all the way down to slaves, and lots of different people in between. Your position within this hierarchy determined your legal agency and your worth. So it's important to understand this is the world in which Brigid is functioning. It was an agricultural economy, rural. As I said, we had kings and lords, slavery. I mean, we know this from very many sources, obviously the most famous being St. Patrick. Status, I say there, is important. And within this system, women had limited legal capacity. Okay, so women were dependent on men. So their closest male relative, according to the law texts, whether that was her father, her brother, her husband, or some other male figure. So kind of in relation to Bridget, then what we really need to bear in mind is both of these things, status and kind of gender. Far from being a bastion of female expression and independence, medieval Irish society was overwhelmingly patriarchal. So within this system, you know, each person had this honour price, and a grown woman over the age of 14 had half the honour price of this closest male relative. So while popular images of powerful fictional Celtic, so-called Celtic women, such as Queen Maeve of the Táin, imply a level of prestige attained by certain women in early Irish society, the historical sources show us that a woman was defined by her closest male relative. These are just a few examples from the law text showing that women had limited independent legal capacity. So along with children under the age of 14 and slaves and the insane, women were classed as legally incompetent and senseless in the laws, and forbidden in most cases to act as witnesses. Female evidence was classed as biased and dishonest, right? I have one example here from a law text called the Dira law text. It says the worst of transactions are women's contracts, for a woman is not capable of selling anything without the consent of one of those who has authority over her. Her father looks after her when she's a girl, her husband looks after her when she's a spouse, her sons look after her, and then the church looks after her when she is a woman of the church. Okay? So for Bridget to create such a massive impact within, you know, what the law texts portray as a very misogynistic and restrictive society, she must have been, you know, well connected, thick-skinned and defiant, but more on this later. Enter then into this society the church, and I've the images here on the slide of this Ireland that we all have in our mind, you know, the so-called golden age of Irish history, the Isle of Saints, you know, which we sell globally as the defining era of Irish heritage. And these are the images and the sites that populate the Irish landscape and the tourism industry, you know, the Ireland of the Book of Kells, Skellig Michael, high crosses and round towers. So, of course, our key figure so far to date, you know, let's talk about it again in 2 years' time when Bridget has had her proper time in the sun. We enter Patrick, okay? Enter, you know, the dawn of Irish history, right? Portrayed beautifully here in the stained glass window. Actually, the earliest reference to the starting date we have in Irish history, and history in terms of written sources, is we count it as the year 431, when in the Chronicle of Prosper of Aquitaine, it says that the Pope sent Palladius to the Irish believing in Christ. Straight away, this statement tells us there were already Christians in Ireland at this time. Also, the observant amongst you will notice the convenient, coincidence between the year 431, which is a real date in early Irish history, which many of these literate early clerics would have known, ties in very well with 432, the date that Armagh made up for Patrick. So we have to anyway, this is the context. We have the early Irish church in which kind of Bridget is functioning in, right? Kind of roughly contemporary with Patrick. This early Irish church, I say a Roman church ? Because while the Irish church very much portrayed itself as a Roman church, actually what we're learning now as scholars, when we fully interrogate the sources properly, that there was really no homogeneity of practice amongst all of what we might call Western Christendom until perhaps the year 800 at a minimum. Okay, so this whole period in these earlier centuries, what you have are edicts being published from the Pope in Rome, but on a practical level, we have enterprising bishops, so we have different clerics in certain areas who are adapting to local circumstances or to their own maybe political interest or that kind of thing. So the Irish Church was certainly attempting to be very much so, calling itself very much a Roman Church. But as I said, nowhere really. There was no real homogeneity of practice like you would get from the Vatican today. Okay, so it's a different church functioning everywhere at this time. Ireland, the Irish Church, was no more unique or the same as everywhere else. Now, at this point, I'd like to just deviate for a moment just to talk about religious faith and history. And there's a big difference between religion as an organised thing and faith. Okay, so your personal faith, what someone believes, is, you know, beyond the scope of a historical inquiry, right? Okay, you'd need to go back. We can say what the church was saying was happening, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can get an insight into individuals' own, you know, thoughts and beliefs. Okay, so we get a lot of comments in relation to Bridget about pre-Christianity, about goddesses and this kind of thing. Unfortunately, we don't have any independent written sources in Ireland testifying to pre-Christian beliefs or religions. Of course, they existed. We just don't have any evidence as to what form they might have taken. Okay, what we do have is a lot of evidence for early Christianity. Okay, so that's kind of our starting point, right? Our written sources, however, are mostly composed through the prism of the church, through the prism of Christianity, sanctioned by the church. So again, there's also an inherent bias in that, okay? So we have to kind of bear that in mind when we are reading the sources also, okay? So again, we're exploring these different various contexts in which Bridget was functioning in. Again, this is all to kind of set the groundwork so we can understand the activities and achievements of Bridget herself. So within the church, women were afforded an opportunity to step outside this, you know, the gendered legal restraints of society. The abbess or leader of a women's religious community, of which there were very many, and Tracy Collins, archaeologist, she has a book out recently and is doing loads of articles and talks and everything, brilliant work on female monasticism. And I think she says there's up to 500 different ecclesiastical settlements, and she goes through all of the ones that have been explicitly identified as associated with women. So again, there's a lot of work going on, you know, about kind of bringing women back to the fore in history, because you wouldn't know it from reading the sources, but women did exist in the past. So what within the church, women, again, they're able to step outside a little bit the restrictive society. So the abbess, or the leader of a women's community, she was the most notable exception to the rules limiting women's agency. Okay, so this leader, she would control land and negotiate deals, and she would wield comparatively significant influence in society. And female monasticism provided one of the very few routes by which a woman could achieve social and political power. But again, this was limited and controlled. Women who became heads of major ecclesiastical foundations, such as the abbesses of Kildare, probably such as Bridget, they were usually members of royal dynasties. Okay, they were supported by powerful male relatives. They were probably aristocratic in themselves or had some connections. Right, only girls in monasteries or royal girls or the daughters of poets and professors were likely to receive an education. Even within this system, what we see in the sources, and I have an example now from a source about St. Bridget, women were torn between their duty to marry, so the constraints of the secular society in which they were living, and their desire to join the church. Okay, so the lives of the saints, for example, describe situations where different societies around, again, what we might term Western Christendom, reacted aggressively to nuns and to religious women, and we see rape and decapitation even being common themes. So many saints resorted to self-mutilation to avoid marriage and preserve their chastity, or at least they're represented as such, such as the famous image here of St. Lucy. St. Bridget herself blinded herself to escape matrimony. So Bethu Brichte, which is a later account of the life of Bridget from the 9th century, it offers us an insight into how these actions affected society. So what it says in the text is, "The beautiful eye which is in your head will be betrothed to a man, though you will like it or not," said her brother. Here is that beautiful eye for you, responds Bridget. I deem it unlikely that anyone will ask you for a blind girl. And what we're seeing in this text is that Bridget's brothers were greatly aggrieved that she had robbed them of their rightful bride price. So women were often valuable commodities which families were not willing to give up. So now, kind of having established Bridget's world, let's get back to those kind of so-called biographical facts about what we know about her, okay? So if we look again at place, right? So we're thinking about a biography of someone. Where are they from, right? Especially in Ireland, you want to know all the connections. How do you know them? You must be related to them somewhere along the line. And we are lucky. With Bridget, we have very clear where she's from. The earliest sources about Bridget, they have a consensus in relation to this. She is very definitely from a kin group called the Faughart, who had branches mostly in Leinster, okay? The Croghan Hill in Offaly, which is pictured here, that's mentioned as an important area of the Faughart, and also so kind of areas around Offaly, the plains, of Magliffa and Kildare, and what was the diocese of Kildare, okay? So this very firmly places her. She's of the Faughart. She's a Faughart woman. She's a Leinster woman, okay? Very much so Leinster, I would say. It comes out very clearly in all of the early texts about Bridget, okay? So that's great. We can very firmly place her in a geographical location. In terms of family, we also have more information for Bridget than we do for a lot of other early individuals from the time period. So she was attached to a branch of the Faughart known as the Ivrazil, which was a hereditary ecclesiastical family within the territory of the Ifalga, right? Seeing as the Faughart, while they were aristocratic, they were actually fairly low-key. They were kind of down the totem pole a little bit. They weren't a major political power in the province. It's quite unlikely that Bridget's association with them was made up, okay? We agree that it's a credible association, okay? Some Irish saints were given patently phony family trees by later authors who were keen to associate them, to associate their own local patron with famous kings and legendary figures from the past. We don't have this in relation to Bridget. She's very firmly placed in a historical time and place. If Bridget didn't exist, or if Bridget was made up by a man who co-opted a pre-Christian goddess, they would have invented a better story for her. It's a fairly standard, boring story. So it would have been easy for a more influential dynasty in Leinster to claim her as their own, and this happened the whole time in the lives of the early saints, if her ancestry wasn't verifiable, okay? Or indeed for Kildare's rivals outside of Leinster, for example Armagh, to discredit Bridget's historicity during the 7th century battle for leadership of the Irish Church. So most sources also agree that Bridget was the daughter of a nobleman, Dovtuch, and her mother is named as Bruchsach. And so again, the early sources agree in all these details. What we do have a disagreement on is whether her mother was a slave of Dovtuch's or not, okay? So in Cogitosus, who is writing from the Church of Kildare, he says, he doesn't mention, he just says that you have, noble father Dovtuch and his wife Bruchsach. Whereas some of the other early sources about Bridget say they claim that she was a slave. And again, this kind of sets up the scene perfectly in those stories for a hero origin story, born into adversity, one of the people straddling both worlds, that kind of thing. So it makes a much more interesting kind of literary arc and everything. But what we do see from this is that, and other sources, that this was kind of standard again in society, that you had men, having children with slaves and that kind of thing, with multiple different, sexual partners. Now, the brothers that were mentioned just a second ago in Bethu Brigid, they aren't necessarily real, but what's really important about the story that I showed you is it's used to, elucidate Bridget's virtues, such as virginity, fortitude, and devotion to God. Okay, but again, we have some firm biographical details about Bridget there, and we'll move swiftly onwards to some more. So, her achievements. So, the most important thing you might ask, you say it the whole time now, someone says someone's famous, and you say, why? What did they do? What are they famous for? What have they achieved? Okay? And even if we don't know anything about them, that's really why we're talking about them. That's why we're remembering them. And Bridget's achievements were quite remarkable. So I say that she's the most famous woman saint in Ireland. Arguably, she's one of the most famous women saints globally too. she patron saint and founder of the Church of Kildare, which I'll get onto, no mean feat. She negotiated with kings. She spread Christian messages of compassion and charity. One of her major achievements, I would say, you might think is odd, but is actually the sources written about her. She has 3 very famous and popular lives that were written about her in the earliest period. So 2, we only have a number of lives of saints written from, let's say, the 7th century, and 2 of them are written about Bridget. We have one about Kilcullen as well, and we also have one about Patrick, and we also have a collection of stories about Patrick as well. So Bridget really comes to the fore. If you are like me, a historian focusing on 7th century Ireland, it's all Bridget, 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 Kildare, Kildare, Kildare. Bridget and Kildare are a really big deal. So these sources, again, I count them as an achievement of Bridget, that so many documents were written down about her in kind of the earliest period that we have any written sources surviving. Okay, so kind of associated with that is the impact that Bridget made. And again, to me, as a historian of the early church, her biggest impact is founding the Church of Kildare, which became one of the most influential institutions in medieval Ireland for very many centuries. So as I tell my students in Maynooth, Kildare was the centre of the universe in the Middle Ages. Dublin didn't exist, you know, and the kids, the primary school kids as well, when I talk to them, their mind is blown by that. You know, Dublin didn't exist. We're so Dublin centric now. But Kildare and Armagh were kind of like the big, and Clonmacnoise, of course, were the big centres in this kind of pre-urban Ireland, okay? In the Old Irish triads written in the 9th century, Kildare is called the heart of Ireland. And also Kildare is mentioned as having one of the 3 stone buildings of Ireland, along with Armagh and Clonmacnoise. Kildare was a massive pilgrimage site. And it was a female-led double monastery. So some scholars are dubious about the historicity of Bridget, but we do know for certain that a woman founded this Church of Kildare, okay? Which, as I said, goes on to become one of the most powerful institutions on the island for almost a millennium. Now, the woman's name could have been anything, but it may as well have been Bridget as any other. The sources tell us that this woman's name was Bridget. But it's important to stress the fact that it's not disputed that a woman founded this church. The Church of Kildare didn't need to fabricate a fake female founder. On the contrary, given the fact that women couldn't perform priestly duties, one of the earliest accounts of St. Bridget, written by a cleric Cogitosus in Kildare around the year 675, he's at pains to explain that she worked in tandem with her Bishop Conlade. Okay, he's very clearly showing it was all above board and proper. She had a man to work alongside her to perform these priestly duties. So it's something that really is corroborated by the other sources and how we know the early church and society functioned. Now, what Cogitosus describes again, he describes the ostentatiously decorated tombs of both Bridget and Conlade flanking the altar in the Church of Kildare, attracting many pilgrims and much revenue to Kildare, making Bridget one of the most celebrated women in Western Christendom. Now, such was Bridget's inspirational leadership, her original community of followers of Kildare became and remained this massive institution. A fight for the title of head of the Irish Church was played out in the 7th century between Kildare and Armagh. And if history had turned out a bit differently, maybe Bridget would have had, the public holiday all these years instead of Patrick. It's expressed in all the sources as a tussle between the 2 saints. So they're friends, they're working together, but also they're kind of adversaries in terms of Kildare and Armagh in the 7th century. So again, many years after Patrick and Bridget roamed the earth. Now, Cogitosus describes the huge crowds that were drawn to Kildare from, visiting the body of Bridget. And he says they came from every province throughout the whole of Ireland by the fame of her good deeds and to visit her lavish tomb. He made bold claims that Bridget's foundation was the head of all the churches, Irish churches, with supremacy over the monasteries of the Irish, with a jurisdiction extending over the whole land of Ireland, reaching from sea to sea. Now, Armagh, contemporary with this, is countering these claims. It says that it ought to be, that it has precedence and ought to be venerated on account of the relics of Peter and Paul, Stephen and Lawrence and others from Rome, and the most holy blood of Jesus Christ, because of course Armagh did not have the body of Patrick. Okay, what we see in these texts is that it's a real sore point here. We have this massive lavish tomb of Bridget in Kildare that everyone is flocking to see. So Armagh it reads, they're a little bit defensive, and we have lots of cool stuff here too. Ultimately, Armagh wins this battle of supremacy for political reasons. Mostly, they were backed by the powerful Ineal patrons. Nevertheless, very early in this time period, so by the year 700, we see the fame of Bridget had already spread to the continent. Very compelling evidence that Bridget, as founder of Kildare, she was famed at this really early date. It comes in this form, in this little relic tag that would have been attached to relics that no longer remain. The tag just remains in the Abbey of Saint Maurice d'Augon in Switzerland. And the tag indicates that the relics of not only Bridget, but also her first female successor, Abbess of Kildare, Darlugdach, and also Conlade, were venerated by this time. So this is at least a century earlier than the first mention of Bridget as a pagan goddess, of the same name in Ireland. Okay, so I'll just again we'll deviate slightly off track again, just a couple of minutes talk about this whole goddess issue. So the first reference we have in a written source is in Cormac's Glossary, which was composed around 900 again. So we have the fame of Bridget of Kildare, the year 700. We're talking 200 years later, we get the first mention of Bridget as a pre-Christian deity. Okay, she's mentioned here alongside her two sisters. So she's daughters of Dagda, the good god. We have a female poet, and also the doctor and the smith. And we also, there's a lot of, people make a lot of comparisons, potentially justifiably so, with the devotion of Brigantia in Gaul, and there's a definite link, I think, between the timing of February 1st. Personally, I can't find any evidence to place Bridget's death or her feast day around February 1st, except that it is also the date of Imbolc. It's a bit coincidental to me that they're not associated. One scholar makes a really convincing argument that Cogitosus, when he's writing about all of these crowds flocking to Kildare to come and see Bridget and bringing all this revenue into the Church of Kildare, that this was happening anyway on one of these harvest days. Okay, so at this early spring market day, feast day, that people were coming into Kildare anyway, and some of them were definitely coming for Bridget, but he takes ownership of all of them. Okay, so that they're all coming to the church to see the tomb of Bridget, and it's quite a convincing argument that then the real woman, that she's given the association between this day, this time period in the year when everyone traditionally is going to go to Kildare. You can celebrate, you can, go to market day and also visit the tomb of Bridget. Okay, so he's bringing everyone into Kildare on this day. And I don't doubt that Bridget's popularity and that her legacy was definitely bolstered by the fact that she shares a name with this goddess. We can see that today, her popularity definitely today. A lot of people are associating her with this goddess. And I don't see any reason why maybe she could have been associated with this woman in the Middle Ages as well. Just to kind of, before I finish up, kind of get into a bit of kind of the legacy of Bridget. Her long-term legacy is obviously massive. We've a new public holiday, of course, now in her holiday. She was part of the holy trio of Irish patron saints, along with Patrick and Columkill. But she left a much bigger legacy around the world than these two did. Okay, I just have a map. I have a picture of Africa because one of the manuscripts, one of the Lives of Bridget, my Cogitosus copy, turned up in Cape Town, in South Africa. a map of Europe, because there are dedications, relics of Brigid all over the place. You know, Lisbon, Tuscany, Bruges, all over the place. So Brigid's cult, as we saw from that relic tag, it travelled to Europe at a relatively early date, and there's dedications to church, everything, all over the place. She just became so widely famous. I have this beautiful mural that they have up in Fahrt in Louth, which kind of shows this dichotomy between, you know, this so-called saint and a goddess. And while, as I've showed you, that there isn't any historical evidence for this, I do think it probably accounts for part of her legacy, and the much later than the early medieval period, the Brigid's cross that we all probably made back in primary school. But again, that's a later part of the development of Bridget and the legacy of Bridget. I think what ensures, you know, Bridget's greatness is that she appeals to many different constituencies, and she transcends just the merely local and national. Now, a big part of her legacy for me is this institution of Kildare and the abbesses, the subsequent abbesses of Kildare. Because what's key about Bridget is that it's not just her own position that was exalted as abbess of Kildare, but it's all the women who came after her, and we can't forget that. That's such an important part of her legacy, because the female head of Kildare controlled vast wealth and held a powerful political office, and I've shown you that that was not typical for women in early Ireland. You know, notes on an early Irish law text, Brethach Chronology, says that the abbess of Kildare is the one who turns back the manifold sins of war through her prayers. Okay, so, you know, another slide, the Irish Annals, the women of Kildare, right? Abbesses of Kildare were the only women whose obits were regularly recorded in the annals, more frequently commemorated even than Queens of Tara. Okay, so when you're reading the annals, the most famous, we have very few records of women in the Irish sources, but the way to become a powerful woman and to make any kind of an impact was to become abbess of Kildare. So just a few examples of some of the women that were commemorated in the annals. Now, such was the influence wielded by the woman who was in this position that by the 9th century, it was claimed in this text that I showed you before, Bridget, and also it was implied much later at the Synod of Kells-Mellifont in 1152. It's claimed that the abbess of Kildare had been exercising the privilege of precedence over other bishops. Bridget says that Bridget herself was actually consecrated as a bishop. She wasn't. However, what we can see from this text is that in the 9th century, the aspirations of the leaders and patrons in Kildare were that the female leader of Kildare had a high status equal to men. Okay, so it's telling us about how important Kildare was in the 9th century, which is worth stating. Not that Bridget herself was consecrated a bishop in the, centuries earlier. Again, in the Synod of Kells-Mellifont, we have comments that basically what it sounds to me when you read it, like, you know, the women of Kildare are getting a bit too big for their boots. You're not as important as the men, so, you know, step back, step down. Okay, now kind of then to get onto maybe personality, that's what people kind of ask me about Bridget and what you might look to ascertain about someone if you read a biography. But we all know, and I know this is, I feel like it's worth saying because people forget this about medieval history. If you're reading a biography of someone now, are you getting really into what the person was like? It depends on who's written the biography. Is it an autobiography? People have public and private personas, right? And unless someone leaves you, unless you accidentally come across their diaries that they never intended to be published, you're not really going to get into, perhaps you'd need to talk to their spouse, their family, whatever. You really need to get into it. How well can we really know any famous person, right? If I was to consider what Bridget's personality were, what her attributes were, again, there's a lot of consensus, a lot of the text. So there's a lot of early texts written about Bridget, and they agree with each other in a lot of respects. So they agree that she was very inclusive, that she was devout, that she had an affinity with animals, that she was hospitable. I love Dr. Elva Johnston's phrase. She calls her the patron of the powerless. That is definitely the way Bridget comes across in every text about Bridget. To me, based on my, study of all of those contexts I explained to you at the start, She was probably well educated and well connected. She was certainly highly respected. And I think to function in this society, she must have been assertive and determined and what I call a boss for her to have achieved anything within this, for her to have left this legacy and the Church of Kildare. So that's kind of, I think we can get a little bit of a way to understanding the kind of personality a woman like Bridget must have had to achieve all the things that she did. So, you know, this is kind of by way of trying to get around to what we think is the real St. Bridget. And, you know, I hope to have shown you this evening that not only was Bridget definitely real, but we actually can get some way of understanding what she really would have been like, what she really achieved, place her in a firm geographical location and time period. And if we interrogate the sources, we can see that quite clearly. We don't need to necessarily blow Bridget up or reduce her, depending on your perspective, into, you know, any kind of supernatural deity in order to appreciate her power. Eschewing expected gender norms centred on their reproductive abilities, religious women in medieval Ireland spurned marriage and devoted themselves to the church instead. And for a few, like Bridget, this offered a rare opportunity to establish and govern lasting institutions. So the real woman who founded Kildare, therefore, would have been cool, charismatic and determined. I think it does a disservice to the real Bridget to hide her real achievements behind the unattainable ideals of saints to a certain extent and goddesses. Bridget of the Faughart, the Leinster woman, she worked hard to build an inclusive church and to found a community. And in doing this, she captured the imagination of a nation, creating a legacy that's lasted 1,500 years. And that she did all of this despite being a woman is something special and something worth celebrating. Thank you. According to Cogitosis, it's almost, you know, he kind of presents it almost as self-evident because Kildare is the greatest place on the earth. You know, it was within the jurisdiction, you know, of the Faughart, of the, you know, the area that her family were connected with. But bar that, as I said, Cogitosis, you know, claims that, you know, this was, you know, beautiful area in the plains of Maglifa. So, yeah. So the thing is that we don't have any evidence of the no. Listen, we do have some mentions in Christian sources to, oh, you're supposed to worship the one true God, right? And you're not supposed to, you know, you have to forsake all others, that kind of thing. But they're coming from a Christian perspective, so it's even hard to say. I couldn't. It's so biased that I couldn't say, you know, that we have any understanding of what role. Anything, again, the language as well, most of the times the word druid isn't even used, you know, in the Latin text the word magi, kind of like a magician, you know, kind of is used. However, I think kind of that's not, you know, maybe a very fair way to answer your question. I think really at the crux of it is that the church became relatively quickly very embedded within the power structures in Irish society. So the expression of, you know, local power was invested in the local church. So it was the church in general that was taking over, and not necessarily just Bridget. Just Bridget becomes one of the foremost people of this early church, one of the most famous ones. And again, partly because Kildare became such a powerful institution as well. Yeah, so, you know, wells can be problematic in that we can't date exactly when individual ones might have been associated. You know, like if you could date one to be considerably earlier, maybe than the other in the right period, that could help. But We do have holy wells associated with a lot of early saints and with a lot of early sites. So I'm working on a big project that was mentioned on Clonard and Finian at the moment, and there's a very important well there next to the earliest site in Clonard. And what we see in another source about Patrick, written by a cleric called Tirachon, kind of roughly contemporary with Cogitosus. He shows how the wells in the landscape were Christianized and co-opted, and he gives an explicit kind of description of how Patrick blessed and Christianized a well that was already important in the landscape. And again, I think what you find with the church everywhere is that it adapted very well to local circumstances and to local communities and local landscapes. So the church didn't come in and destroy whatever places that people found important to them, that kind of thing. The church just assimilated into that system. So particular places in the landscape, even topographically, if you go places now, somewhere that is on the ford of a river, or so a high point, all of these things which are, if you don't have electricity and cities and cars and that kind of thing, are self-evident as somewhere that's going to be crucial in the landscape. These continue to be important to people across centuries. That's what I found. I found that especially in my work on the cult of relics, that the tangible, place and tangible items continue to be important to people regardless of organised religion or faith or that kind of thing. So today, these same places might be important, not because of Druids or Celtic, there's no such thing as Celtic, by the way, except just in relation to language, but the pagan religion or even, a church or anything. People might go to these places now because they're beautiful, right? Because you can get a gorgeous, walking spot. So places continue to be important, as like, for example, the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. That now attracts way more people, loads of people who don't even have any Christian faith. They go doing the Camino because it's either spiritually relevant to them in a different way, or because it's a beautiful thing to do. It's a physical activity for them to do. It can, there's a community to tap into. So places, I think, continue to be important to people across centuries, even when you have big cultural changes like the church coming in and the church waning out, and it's all, to me, it's all like everything. We're just such a small dot, in the, on the earth. And when you look at history over centuries and centuries, you see how kind of cyclical things kind of can tend to be. What we don't have, which is a problem for Kildare, what we don't have is a lot of archaeological evidence, because Kildare continued to be such an important site. So you're not going to go in now and dig up the town of Kildare, which is what they've done for Clonmacnoise and for Glendalough. So like, for example, as I said, organising this big event with Kildare County Council and Maynooth University for next September 2024, and I'm struggling to get archaeologists who can come and talk, because there's so little it's so hard to kind of date anything like holy wells, or we don't have the same archaeological evidence. We're not digging up the church in Kildare to see if we can find the tomb of Bridget underneath it, that kind of thing. It continued, the original church would have been made very small and made of wood, and we know this from evidence in other places. That would have been replaced with a small stone church quite early on in Kildare's case, and then that would have been replaced again, by the current church that you have there now and through the centuries. So it's kind of mainly the sites that go out of kind of political importance that we're able to get loads of archaeological evidence from. So Armagh, again, is another example where you're not going to dig up Armagh, but you can see things like the concentric circles and that kind of thing, and the legacy of these places. But we have very little archaeological evidence for the early site of Kildare.
Okay, well, if no one else has any questions, it just remains for me to thank Niamh once again for a wonderful start to our lectures. I want to thank Sean Sork, who's up there somewhere, for sorting out the IT, very important on these occasions. And I think Nessa, our hostess, has arranged some tea for us outside. I think Niamh is sticking around for tea, so if you have any other questions that occur to you in the meantime. So thanks once again, Niamh, for a wonderful
Thank you for
talk.
having me.